Hey, another video within a year. Who would have thought? So, like I mentioned last time, one thing I really wanted to do with my videos was shine a light on some lesser known games, or games that I feel like are just underappreciated in the larger market. There are two series that I will always dub an absurd amount of love out for that fit into that category for me. Armored Core, a series that I have loved to death since I first played it back on the original PlayStation, and a more recent contender, the Legend of Heroes Trails series. The Legend of Heroes is an RPG franchise extending all the way back to the MSX computer, TurboGrafx 16, all that, and it's had multiple iterations. But after completing a trilogy of games on the PSP, they decided that their next games would be much larger in scope than anyone could have possibly imagined, and that ended up being the Trails games. There are currently 12 Trails games out in the US at the time of recording, with the next entry in the story coming out early next year, and a remake of the first game coming out incredibly soon by the time I put this up. Trails games are separated into multiple story arcs, much like anime, and each one is represented by a change in the title. It all starts with Trails in the Sky, a trilogy set in the small kingdom of Liberl, where ancient powers are being awakened by a shadowy organization, and two fresh members of the adventuring guild of the series, the Bracers, slowly becomes the heroes that the kingdom needs. And while their paths start at the same point, they end up walking very different trails before meeting up again. Then the third game puts a little bow on it and sets up for what's to come on the continent as a whole. Then comes Trails from Zero and Trails to Azure, often referred to as the Crossbell duology, since it's just two games, and they are focused on the city-state of Crossbell, situated between the two biggest powers on the continent, the Empire of Erebonia and the Calvard Republic. These games follow a small police team in Crossbell focused on trying to work better with the community and regain public trust. After the Sky games and Crossbells set them up, the next step on the journey takes us to the Erebonian Empire in the Trails of Cold Steel games, where we follow a unique new class set up in the prestigious Thor's Military Academy as they become entangled in the very fate of the world, spanning a whopping 5 of the games, the last of which serves as a true ending for Crossbell. Then the continent is finally at peace, and of course it can't last. That brings us to the current arc, Trails Through Daybreak. After the situation with Erebonia settles down, the Calvard Republic is experiencing a new age of prosperity, and we follow the exploits of a Spriggan, someone who operates in the gray areas of the law, fulfilling requests that neither the police or the Bracer Guild can handle. The sole Spriggan of the agency receives a request from a client given a dire warning found in her great-grandfather's journal. Here's how it started for me. I had started Trails in the Sky and didn't get very far. It felt like it wasn't really giving me a lot to get invested with the story starting off, and I left it by the wayside for a while, until Trails of Cold Steel 4, freshly released in Japan, showed characters from Trails in the Sky coming back, clearly older, and I went, wait, these games are all connected? And that gave me the push I needed to go back to Trails in the Sky and start following up on what was going on. While it started off with very low stakes, it eventually did ramp up and become very engaging. The second game, Trails in the Sky SC standing for second chapter, picks up immediately after the first game and is one of the best RPGs I have ever played. I kept going, and obviously while 2 of the games did not release in English originally, that being the Crossbell duology, all of the mainline games are now available for English markets. The world building is top-notch, the characters are brilliantly written for the most part, and most of all for me, the music is incredible. Every single game lets out banger after banger, and just a simple aside here are 3 of my favorite tracks in the series: Inevitable Struggle,
チャンスです。皆さん、お願いします。分かったわ。了解。そこです。
Fateful Confrontation, And Castle of Illusions Phantasmagoria. They are all in what would technically be the oldest games in the series, but trust me, the later games also have plenty of bangers. With all of that in mind, I do hope I've caught your interest, but you may be struggling with where to start due to the overwhelming number of games that are all interconnected. And while the obvious answer would be the Sky trilogy, I have my own answer. Start with whatever appeals to you the most. Trails in the Sky feels like the most classic RPGs in the series. There's some magic technology going on, but overall it's what you expect. A guild of adventurers with two teenage rookies as the main characters, monsters roaming the world making travel dangerous, a setting that evokes a transitioning period from an advancing the civilization, airships, ancient artifacts being sought after. What sets it apart, though, is there's a lot of focus given to the political situations in Liberl as well. Like I said, it starts off very slow, but becomes undeniably engrossing. The Crossbell duology is a very focused pair of games, focusing on the newly formed Special Support section of the Crossbell Police Department as they deal with organized crime, a cult starting to make moves to bring about some sinister goal, constantly building political upheaval, and at the center of it all is a mysterious little girl that the SSS find and start looking after. The characters and setting are what really does it for me in these games, and there's a question that floats around a lot in gaming circles. What setting would you want to live in for games? After playing Trails from Zero and Trails to Azure, it's absolutely Crossbell for me. These games also show the rise of technology moving towards more modern-day objects like cars, computers, and even very rudimentary cell phones that double as the magic-casting trinkets of the games. Something that, much like cell phones in the real world, will start advancing at an astonishing rate. Trails of Cold Steel might scratch the itch of people who have played the Persona games, with an advancing calendar giving limited time for things to do, and the setting starting out with school life before rapidly evolving into a civil war introducing mechs called Panzer Soldats that are found to be based on more ancient technology, the Divine Knights. These are ancient machines that, while piloted, have sentience of their own. These games have the biggest cast of the series, being split up into two halves between 4 games. The 4th game brings about a boss fight that has been building up since Trails in the Sky SC, and it does not disappoint. And then there's Trails into Reverie, which serves as both a finale for Cold Steel and the Crossbell games, following the protagonists of both games on their separate journeys, as well as a mysterious new masked third protagonist. That then brings us to Trails Through Daybreak, following the exploits of Arkwright Solutions, something akin to a private detective agency and headed by Van Arkwright, known in the underworld as a Spriggan, someone who takes on jobs of a dubious nature. This is the most modern of the games. Technology has advanced to the point where cars are becoming commonplace and the magic trinkets are essentially modern-day smartphones. This is another one that feels heavily focused on the characters, and they are extremely likable and from all walks of life. It also has the best combat of the series. The protagonists for each story arc also are a highlight of the experience too, and might contribute to where you want to start. The first 2 Sky games feature Estelle Bright, the daughter of one of the most powerful warriors on the continent. She has an endlessly positive disposition and a lot of spunk. A lot of that apparently comes from the English localization team, who added a little more flavor to her lines. She only gets shaken briefly over the course of the story, but she quickly regains that spark and it glows even brighter after that. Honestly, that's refreshing to me. Usually the bright, lucky hero sees the ugly truth of the world, and they may stay positive, but they're never really quite as optimistic afterwards. Estelle, she sees how awful things can get and decides she will make everything better by shining even brighter. The third Sky game shifts to Kevin Graham for the main character, who is a secondary character introduced in second chapter. Kevin is a traveling priest of the Septian Church with some hidden depths that make him stand out as a main character even though he only gets the spotlight for this game, and his story alone is enough to ensure that you should not skip the third, which is sometimes written off as unnecessary. The Crossbell duology stars Lloyd Bannings, a young, newly hired detective for the Crossbell Police Department. Lloyd has a very bright outlook, however, as he is a young adult, he has experience that gives him a more balanced perspective of the world. You hear a lot about RPG protagonists that have a strong sense of justice, and it's usually very over the top, but Lloyd has a more nuanced take on justice. He obviously cares about what's right, but he's also willing to bend given the circumstances. Just to give some indication, Lloyd is my favorite protagonist of the series so far. The Cold Steel saga stars Reen Schwarzer, and on the surface, he seems like the most standard protagonist of the series. Polite, humble despite his status, and he makes friends easily. He's also the first protagonist who uses the 8 leaves, 1 blade style of combat that's been commented on and demonstrated previously, but only by secondary characters. While he may seem very standard on the surface, he actually feels more like a deconstruction of the trope, showing the dangers of several characteristics of this archetype. Over the course of 5 back-to-back games in the timeline, he's obviously had the most growth as well, and is often ranked as one of the most popular characters in the series. Daybreak gives us the most different protagonist so far, Van Arkride. Aside from having a very cool name, Van is the oldest protagonist so far, and his personality is also tempered by a lifetime that he describes as a nightmare from the very beginning. Van is a Spriggan, which is essentially a private fixer who straddles the lines of the law, but he also has his own lines that he won't cross no matter how much money he's offered. Or sweets. Van has a massive sweet tooth. He also really loves his car. While he does work this shady profession, Van is very compassionate, and that profession also gives him the options to turn the tables when presented with new facts. Van has come very close to dethroning Lloyd as my favorite protagonist. I find Van extremely relatable personally, I just think Lloyd has more standout moments so far. Van's story isn't done yet. He could very well take that top spot for me in the future. We'll have to see how Trails Beyond the Horizon plays out next year, which Reen also makes a return for. With all that about the individual story arcs out of the way, let's go over some quick things that I love about these games overall. First, like I said, the world building is incredible and the music is consistently a feast for the ears, but another thing I love is the combat. One look at the Sky games and you will see it feels more like a strategy RPG, and they keep building on it with every entry. You have your standard RPG options of attacking, using items, casting magic, or arts as they're called, but there's some interesting twists that this tactical style gives to the combat. Positioning matters. Your attacks can knock enemies back or knock you back, and magic takes time to cast, so you have the opportunity to move before it triggers. Speaking of magic, every character has something called an orbiment that you equip gems called quartz to, and this leads to a lot of customization in how you build your characters, affecting your stats and what spells you can cast. These are the objects I mentioned earlier that are essentially merged with being smartphones later in the series, leading to a very cool way to work a magic system into an everyday object. My favorite thing about the battle system, though, has to be the S-crafts. Every character has crafts, which are attacks unique to the character with varying effects that can change the course of battle, and S-crafts are the character's strongest abilities. They keep getting more awesome as the series continues, and they also let you do an S-break, where you can interrupt the turn order in a battle and have a character interject with their S-craft, which is useful for stealing turn bonuses or just getting enemies knocked out before they have a chance to act again. As much as I love the series, there are some things that I don't care for as well. Like I said, Trails in the Sky has a very sluggish start, and it took a while to hook in. There are also some very problematic relationships be it significant age gaps, unbalanced dynamics in the relationships, or even incestuous, with the caveat of, oh, they're not really related by blood. The only relationship I give a pass for that is Estelle and Joshua from Trails in the Sky, as while Joshua is brought into the Bright family with Estelle's father intending for him to be a sibling figure, numerous story beats and flashbacks show that Joshua was crushing on Estelle before he had even really settled into the Bright family, but even that takes a lot of time to work through. Others, though, hard pass. It's even worse because they get egged on by other characters. The last gripe I have is one that got pointed out in a review. I don't remember where from, but they correctly pointed out that every character has to get a line in for some seeds, and it just feels excessive. Especially in Cold Steel, where you end up with around 20 characters for the final confrontation in Cold Steel 4. Another minor complaint is, while I love the S-Crafts, some of them later in the series, especially the Cold Steel games, fall into the trap of being way too cinematic and taking far too long. You can skip any animation you want, and so it's up to you if you want to just sit through them, but clearly it's been acknowledged because Trails Through Daybreak really cut back the S-Craft animation time, and it really helped the flow of combat. There is actually one extremely nitpicky thing to me. Like any RPG, you acquire and equip new gear, including weapons. It's not unusual to see characters in Japanese RPGs equip armor that doesn't change their appearance. But what bugs me is that the weapons for all of the characters are very unique to them, and you purchase upgrades, and since those weapons are very personal to them, the appearance of the weapons never change. Let's look at the Tales series, for example. The characters never change appearance generally unless you lock new costumes, but they get new weapons and they do show up differently. I could understand back in the Sky and Crossbell games when all of the characters were pre-rendered 3D models, but if they're going to give every character a unique weapon, it feels strange for them to be buying new ones. Just look at Reen and Van. Reen has a tachi that is extremely personal to him, to the point that it's a point of pride for him when his blade is broken, and Van has an experimental sword that's not mass-produced, so it just doesn't make sense if they're able to buy a new one at a moment's notice. I think Daybreak makes a step towards a better solution. Weapon parts that change the stats. Unfortunately, you do still also buy new weapons. Again, this is just a really big nitpick, and I just can't stop thinking about it though. With that out of the way, where do I rank all of these games? Let's do a good old-fashioned tier list. I promise to try and not play favorites, but I can only try. Let's go in order, shall we? For Trails in the Sky, as I mentioned twice already, this has a very slow start and takes time to hook you in, and Estelle doesn't get a ton of development yet as the main character since this game ended up being so long they had to split it up. This goes into C for me. Trails in the Sky SC picks up immediately after the first game since they were originally meant to be one, but it really starts Estelle's development as a main character and reveals so much more about the greater world. It's loaded with unforgettable moments, music that still holds up, and culminates with one of the most satisfying boss battles in the series. Easy S tier. Trails in the Sky the Third, the title for this one alone makes it feel like an add-on, and that's essentially how it feels. It serves to tie up a few loose ends in the story, expand on some previous story elements, and set up for things to come. Kevin as a main character, though, does have some great development and sets up some character arcs for later in the series, and gives us some concepts that will be very important for later in the series. There are people who say this game is skippable, but I think those people are wrong. It has its downsides for sure, but I would still give it a B. Trails from Zero. Getting introduced to your main party at the beginning is an unusual move, but this 4-man band becomes such a tight-knit unit over the course of the game that it's genuinely heartwarming at times. It also moves the series to feeling more like an urban fantasy rather than the borderline steampunk setting of the Sky games. There's not as big of a threat to the world here, but the spotlight on the characters in Crossbell City as a whole is great. I give it an A. Trails to Azure continues the story of the special support section, as Crossbell becomes the focal point for a far bigger threat than the last game. It answers some lingering questions from Zero, expands the playable cast a bit as well to add some variety, and again sets up for some future story elements. This is my favorite game, but I am able to acknowledge its faults. The ending is a mess for starters, and there's some baffling things that happen in the story on occasion. But the characters really drive this one more than anything. It sits right next to Zero for A tier for me. Trails of Cold Steel. We finally get to see Erebonia after it's been referenced ever since the very first game. You might have this impression from the previous games that this country's a rough place, but much like real life, what you hear about a country doesn't always match the reality. Erebonia definitely puts a lot of emphasis on its military, but it's full of people just as normal and hospitable as any other place you've been so far, and that's reflected perfectly by the group this game follows, Class 7 of Thor's Military Academy, which, despite the name, seems very much like a normal Japanese high school. The game is set up much like the first Sky game in that it takes a little bit for the story to really kick off, but unlike Sky, the build up to that kickoff is spent getting to know Class 7 and how they fit into Erebonia's deep social divide. It's also similar in that the ending leads directly into the next game. I give it a solid B. Trails of Cold Steel 2, picking right up from the outbreaking conflict at the end of the first game, pushes Class 7 into the realities of war before they even get to finish their school life. Gathering the class back together, facing new and old enemies alike, and working to neutralize the conflict leads to an unforgettable journey where the cast must move forward relentlessly. Into S tier it goes. Trails of Cold Steel 3 feels like a bridge to greater things. It follows a new Class 7 where a slightly older Reen is their instructor, and thus a lot of time is spent getting to know the new characters as well as advancing Reen as a character. It also brings back a surprising pair of characters from the Sky games. The ending is genuinely shocking, but it's not loaded with as many standout moments before that. This one goes into B. Trails of Cold Steel 4 is the culmination of several plot lines that have been building since Sky's second chapter. Cold Steel 4 feels the most dire out of all of the situations the continent has been through so far, and every single chapter is loaded with great moments. It also brings back characters from the series so far. It really feels like fighting for the fate of the world, with everyone uniting to face the darkness plaguing Erebonia and stop it once and for all. Oh hey, another S tier. Trails into Reverie feels like what Sky the Third was meant to be. It advances the story while closing out several characters' journeys. It acts as both a fifth Cold Steel game and a third Crossbell game, as well as fallout from the previous games coming back to plunge the continent into yet another world-threatening conflict. Where this game succeeds while Sky the Third fell short is it feels more consequential for a huge chunk of the cast instead of only a handful, and the alternate space that the heroes go into is a secondary element with its own mystery instead of being the main setting and story focus. It doesn't have as much of a feeling as resolving a full saga like Cold Steel 4 does, but it has the advantage of having less characters that need development in comparison, as newcomers are limited, and the characters that are there from previous games reach their full potential, making this another S tier. I swear I'm trying to be objective here. Trails through Daybreak. Much like how Cold Steel finally introduced us to Erebonia, Daybreak finally introduces us to the Calvert Republic, the other major power on the continent. Calvert feels like a parallel to the United States in the real world, tackling issues like elitism, racism, and corruption. The result is a much more personal story focusing on the characters, much like the Crossbell games. This game also gives us the biggest evolution of the battle system so far, letting you switch between an active system and a heavily refined turn-based system where moving is finally a free action during your turn instead of eating the turn. The characters and gameplay improvements make this an easy A. Trails through Daybreak 2 I had just finished not too long ago, and I still loved it, but the way some story elements are presented were very annoying to me, but I can't really get into it without spoiling a major plot detail. It also feels a little scattered on the character priority, maybe not as big as Cold Steel got, but some characters felt like they were barely there. There are some very emotional character-driven moments though, and it continues the first game's more personal feel to the story. Overall, I give this one a B. I still loved it, but it strained that love on occasion. The ending also made me cry, and I'm man enough to admit it. As of the time of the making this video, we have a remake of Trails in the Sky coming out soon, and the demo is very promising. However, keep in mind that this will just be the first chapter, as the title of the remake implies, meaning that the cliffhanger from the original is likely intact and you're going to be waiting for a while for the remake of second chapter. But hey, Falcom has essentially confirmed they are working on remaking second chapter as well, so you can experience the same agonizing wait as the rest of the fans from the original felt. And that's it. If this has encouraged you to check out the series, let me know in the comments. Or if you're a seasoned Trails fan, let me know how you feel about the games in the comments. Did you agree with me or disagree with me? Or am I completely off base? Am I based? Am I dead ass? On an unrelated note, I am still trying to do streams every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday over on Twitch at about 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time. However, I'm still dealing with issues with work, emotions, and it leads to some very inconsistent streaming. But if you did drop by on a day I'm streaming, it would mean the world to me. Until next time.